All right, everybody. Let's go ahead and get started. Welcome back to the Dharma Doors. I'm MC Owens, and this is the San Francisco Dharma Collective. And tonight we're going to read another sutta. So, if you've been coming to Dharma Doors or you've been watching Dharma Doors, you know that we've been making our way through the Middle Length Discourses of the Buddha. This evening, we are moving on to a new section of the Majjhima Nikāya. So we are entering what is called the final 50. So the last 50 suttas of the collection. And so we are tonight talking about sutta number 101. This is the Devadaha Sutta. Devadaha is the name of a place. So it's the sutta that the Buddha taught at Devadaha. But you may also notice, if you happen to have this collection, that this is called the Devadaha Vagga. So this is the Devadaha section. But it's only called that because the first sutta is the Devadaha Sutta. So if you've been coming to Dharma Doors, you know that these little groupings usually have a theme. So we just finished the section on the Brahmanyas, on the Brahmins. And so each of those 10 suttas was kind of focused on a different Brahmin. And then we did the section on like the wanderers, and we did a section to monks, and we did a section to lay or householders. Well, now we're kind of moving into sort of a miscellaneous category. The point is that there doesn't seem to be exactly a connective thread, but this is the first of them. But what I'm hoping is that in Dharma Doors, as we move through these, we might be able to detect why are these 10 suttas grouped together. So tonight we're going to start with the Devadaha Sutta. This is a classic early Buddhist sutra. I've taught this sutra a lot. I used to teach it a lot more. It used to be one of my go-to sutras for teaching Buddhism because it's kind of one of those ones that it really it really lays out what is the Buddhist path versus like all of these other traditions and all these other religions. So that's what we're going to get into tonight. Um, it's a rather long sutta, and it's long even if we don't do all of the repetitions. So I'm going to actually probably have to sort of just summarize a few of the sections, but it'll make sense once we start kind of going through the sutta. So once again, we are diving into the Majjhima Nikāya, Sutta number 101 at Devadaha. And so if you want to read along or you just want to listen along, it goes a little something like this. Thus have I heard. On one occasion, the Blessed One was living in the Sakyan country, where there was a town of Sakyans named Devadaha. And there the Blessed One addressed the bhikkhus thus: Bhikkhus, Venerable Sir, they replied. And the Buddha, the Blessed One, said all of this. Bhikkhus, there are some recluses and Brahmins who hold such a doctrine and view as this. They say, whatever a person feels, whether pleasure or pain or neither pleasure nor pain, some people say that all of that is caused by what was done in the past. And so, by annihilating through asceticism past actions And by doing no fresh actions, there will be no consequences in the future, they say. With no consequences in the future, there's the destruction of karma. So the destruction of karmic consequences. And with the destruction of karma, with the destruction of action, there's the destruction of suffering. With the destruction of suffering, there is the destruction of feeling, they say. And with the destruction of feeling, all suffering is exhausted. So speak the Nigantas bhikkhus. Okay, so that is very much the focus of this sutra tonight. So the sutra tonight it's about suffering. It's about feeling unpleasant things or feeling pleasant things or feeling neither pleasant nor unpleasant things, but it's about feeling bad or suffering. And what causes that? Like, why? And the Buddha is telling the bhikkhus, these other people, specifically the Nigantahas, and if you've been coming to Dharma Doors, you know the Nigantahas are the Jain tradition or the Jain tradition of India today. Well, the Jains, they go all the way back to the time of the Buddha. Jainism is in many ways even older than the Buddha. And the Jains were called, in the Buddhist suttas, the Jains are called Nigantahas. And we've encountered the Nigantahas many times before. The Buddha is often getting into debates with the Nigantahas or the Jains. And this sutta tonight, well, it's interesting actually because it's not a debate. What's interesting is that this is just the Buddha telling the bhikkhus, this is how I feel about the Jains. Like, in many ways, nobody even asked him. He's just letting everybody know. So it's important to recognize that that's what's kind of going on with this sutta. So the Buddha is telling the students, some people say dukkha, suffering, is caused by past actions. All right, so that's the first thing that we need to acknowledge about the Jain or the Niganta worldview. It's the idea that suffering is caused by past actions. All right, so that's the first thing. The second thing that we're going to have to notice tonight is that the Nigantahas or the Jains, they believe, or at least, in a way, according to the Buddhists, they believe in literally, by the way, literally burning off or burning away karma, burning away suffering through asceticism. So things like fasting, going without sleep, not sitting down for long periods of time, just austerities or asceticism. In the Jain tradition, according to the Buddha, they believe that if you starved yourself, for example, if you fasted, it would burn away past karmic accrual, like karma that's been building up, that is going to make you suffer, like in the future. The Jains believed that through asceticism that could be burned away. And so the Buddha here is basically saying, the Jains, the Nigantahas, they basically believe that whatever a person feels is caused by what was done in the past. And so by annihilating through asceticism past karmic actions, and by the way, by doing no new karmic actions, there will be no future consequences. That's the logic. And so again, with the destruction of the future karmic causes, there's the destruction of action. And with the destruction of action, there's the destruction of suffering. So as I kind of often am trying to do with Dharma doors, I want to sort of extrapolate a little bit outside of the context of the sutta. And so I want us to tonight, in order to hear the sutta, I want us to be thinking like, oh yeah, it's not just the Nigantahas, it's not just the Jains that think this way. It's actually a pretty commonly held belief that whatever it is you're experiencing right now is the result of your past actions in a way. Like, that's a generally understood idea, right? That if you get a stomach ache, it's from something you ate before. So a past action caused the discomfort of the stomach ache. So the idea that past actions result in present suffering or present experience, that's actually not that uncommon of an idea. All right. So I want us to first of all be thinking about that. And then this idea of burning away bad karma or burning away suffering through like like asceticism in that way. That also isn't that like wild of an idea in terms of people believing that through a kind of self-neglect or a kind of even repression, you can kind of burn away desire, burn away things in that way. So I just want us to kind of keep in mind that this way of thinking is actually not that weird or that unusual in that sense. All right. So the Buddha says to the bhikkhus, this is what the Nigantas think, that dukkha or suffering, which is karma based, is based on past karma. Now the Buddha reports to the bhikkhus saying, now I go to them, I go to the Nigantas, and I say to them, friend Nigantas, is it true that you hold the view, the drishti, that whatever a person feels is based upon past actions, and that by destroying or burning away all of that karma, it will lead to no suffering and the ultimate uh, exhaustion of all suffering? If when asked thus, the Nigantas admit that this is what they think. They say, yes, that's what we think. And now the Buddha asks them something, and we've heard this before, by the way, so I'm only going to summarize this. But the Buddha gets into this thing of, but friends, do you know, do you know for certain that you existed in the past? And do you know for certain that you definitely didn't exist in the past, or that it is not the case that you did not exist in the past? Are you sure about that? And they say, no, friend, we're not sure. But friends, are you totally positive that you committed evil actions in the past and that's why you're suffering right now? And they say, no. But friends, and this is an important one, do you know that so just such and such a suffering or just so much suffering has already been burned away by you? Or that such and such suffering is still yet to be exhausted? Or do you know for certain that when so much suffering has been exhausted, all suffering will have been exhausted? And they say, no, friend, we're not sure of the exact amount of suffering we have yet to burn away. We're just going to keep trying, right? But we're not sure. But friends, he says, do you know what the abandoning of unwholesome states is and what the cultivation of wholesome states is right here and now? And they say, no, friend, we don't know about that. And of course, the idea of abandoning unwholesome states and cultivating wholesome states here and now, that's the Buddhist path. And so he's asking them, so have you even considered what I'm teaching regarding the here and now? And they say, no, we haven't considered that. And now I'm really going to summarize. This is where the Buddha says, oh, well, then it seems to me that you don't know that you existed in the past for sure. You don't know you have so much suffering left to burn off. You're not sure exactly how much suffering you have left to burn off. And you've never even given what I'm teaching a chance. And they agree with that. He also says, now, if you knew for certain that you existed in the past, and if you knew for certain that you had this much suffering left to burn off, and if you knew for certain that cultivating wholesome actions here now wasn't the way, if you knew all of that for certain, he says, then it would be appropriate for you to say what you're saying. But you just admitted that you don't know all of that for certain. And he says, and therefore, what you're saying kind of isn't logical. And in order to explain this, the Buddha uses an analogy. So now I'm over on section 7, paragraph 7. And the Buddha says, friend Nigantas, suppose a man were wounded by an arrow that was thickly smeared with poison. And because of this, he felt painful, racking, piercing feelings, suffering. Then his friends and companions, his kinsmen and relatives, they brought a surgeon. The surgeon would cut around the opening of the wound with a knife, probe for the arrow with a probe, pull out the arrow, and apply a medicinal powder to the opening of the wound. And, by the way, at each step of this, all along the way, the man would feel painful, racking, piercing feelings. But then, on a later occasion, when the wound was healed and covered with thick skin, the man would be happy and well, independent, master of himself, able to go wherever he likes. And he might think, before I was pierced by an arrow thickly smeared with poison, and because of this, I felt painful, racking, piercing feelings of suffering. But then my friends and my companions, my kinsmen and relatives, they brought a surgeon. And the surgeon cut around the opening of the wound with a knife, probed for the arrow with a probe, pulled out the arrow, applied medicinal powder, and at each step, I felt painful, racking, piercing feelings. But now that the wound is healed and covered over with skin, I'm well and happy. I'm independent. I'm my own master. I'm free to go wherever I like. The Buddha says, so too, friend Nigantas, if you knew for certain that you existed in the past and that it was not the case that you did not exist and so on, and that you knew about the abandoning of wholesome states, what it is, and what the cultivation of wholesome states is here and now, if that were so, it would be fitting for you people to talk and declare the way that you do. But since, friend Nigantas, since you don't know that you existed in the past, and that it's not the case that you did not exist, and you aren't sure about how much suffering you have left, and you don't know about abandoning unwholesome states and cultivating wholesome states here and now, it is not fitting for you Nigantas to declare that whatever a person feels is caused by past actions. All right. Now, the analogy of the surgeon with the arrow, that's going to come back. And it all has to do with the fact that when the doctor was treating the arrow and like pulling it out, the man was feeling piercing, racking feelings. But afterwards, he was not. And he was free to go wherever he'd like. That's what we want to remember from the analogy of the surgeon, because it's going to come back around. All right. Now, the Buddha, again, he's just reporting all of this to the bhikkhus, saying, this is what I have to say about the Nigantas. And after he says all of this to the bhikkhus, he reports to them that when I say this, when I told this to the Nigantas, they told me, well, friend, our leader, our teacher, the Niganta Nataputta, he's omniscient. He's all-seeing. And he claims to have complete knowledge and vision thus. He says that whether I'm walking or standing or asleep or awake, knowledge and vision are continuously and uninterruptedly present to me, he says. He says, so the Niganta Nataputta, our leader, our teacher, he says, Nigantas, you've done evil actions in the past. Exhaust them with the performance of piercing austerities. And when you are here and now restrained in body, speech, and mind, that is doing no evil actions for the future. And so, by annihilating through asceticism past actions and by doing no fresh new actions, there will be no consequences in the future. With no consequences in the future, all suffering will be exhausted. And the Nigantas, they tell me, we approve and accept this, and so we are satisfied. In other words, the Buddha is kind of calling the Nigantas a kind of a cult in that way, where they're saying, yeah, we don't know how much suffering we have. Our leader's just telling us that we've done evil in the past. And he's telling us that that's why we're suffering now, because of things we did in the past. We don't know it. We have no actual awareness of this. We're just in a cult. That's basically what the Nigantas, at least, again, according to the Buddha's way of reporting this. So, when this was said, I told the Nigantas, there are 5 things, friends Nigantas, that might turn out different later on. What are those 5 things that might turn out different later on? Faith, social approval, an oral tradition, reasoned cogitation, and a reflective acceptance of a view. These 5 things might turn out in 2 different ways later on. Now, that section, by the way, the 5 things that might be different later on, there's a whole other sutta that we read a few weeks ago, maybe about a month ago. It was sutta number 95, the sutta to the Brahman Chanki. And the Buddha went into great detail about the 5 things that might turn out different later on. And basically, though, the idea is that it's fine to have faith in something, but the Buddha says, but be aware, it might turn out different later on. So faith can change. Also, something that is socially approved, years later, it might not be socially approved. So that's the second type of thing that gets, it's a second type of knowledge that gets passed on that might turn out to be different later on, the Buddha says, as well as an oral tradition. Just because something has been passed down orally, generation to generation, it might turn out to be wrong or different later on. The next is vitarka, reasoned cogitation. Yeah, you might reason something out and come to a firm conclusion. The Buddha's saying, though, that that might change with new information. And so, don't get too hung up on it in that way. And then number 5 is actually like taking on a drishti, taking on a view after careful consideration of it. The Buddha's saying, yeah, hold a view, but just be aware that things might change later on. Okay, the 5 things that might turn out to be different is not essential to this sutra. So that was my quick summary of it there. Okay, and now we need to get back to a really important idea. It's kind of at the heart of this teaching. So the Buddha, now I'm moving on to section 12, chapter 12. After talking about the 5 things that might turn out to be different, which he tells to the Nigantas, he says, again, bhikkhus, I said to the Jains, I said to the Nigantas, what do you think, friend Nigantas? When there's intense exertion, intense striving, do you then feel painful, racking, piercing feelings due to intense exertion? But when there's no intense exertion, no intense striving, do you then not feel any painful, racking, piercing feelings due to intense exertion? And they replied, when there's intense exertion, friend Gautama, intense striving, well, yeah, then we feel painful, racking, piercing feelings due to intense exertion. But when there's no intense exertion, no intense striving, then we don't feel any painful, racking, piercing feelings due to intense exertion. And the Buddha says, so it seems to me, friends, that when there's intense exertion, you feel painful, racking, piercing feelings due to such intense exertion. But when there's no intense exertion, you don't feel any painful, racking, piercing feelings due to such intense exertion. That being so, it's not fitting for you guys, for you venerable Nigantas, to declare that whatever a person feels, whether it's pleasure or pain or neither pleasure nor pain, it's not appropriate for you guys to say that all of that's caused by what was done in the past. And that's so by annihilating through asceticism past actions and by doing no fresh new actions, there won't be any consequences in the future. That's not right. If, friend Nigantas, if when there was painful, intense exertion, intense striving, then painful, racking, piercing feelings due to intense exertion were present, and when there was no intense exertion, no intense striving, then painful, racking, piercing feelings due to intense exertion were still present. If that were the case, then it would be fitting for you guys to talk about past actions. But since, friend Nigantas, when there's intense exertion, intense striving, then you feel painful, racking, piercing feelings. But when there's no intense exertion, then you don't feel painful, racking, piercing feelings. You are therefore feeling only the painful, racking, piercing feelings of your self-imposed exertion. And it's through ignorance, unknowing, and delusion that you mistakenly hold that whatever a person experiences, whether painful or pleasant, is caused by past actions. And speaking thus, bhikkhus, I did not see any legitimate defense of the position of the Nigantas. Very quickly, allow me to summarize that because I know I moved that through that really quickly. So the Buddha uses this example of intense striving and intense exertion of effort and painful, racking, piercing feelings. And what he says is, and actually, I'll use an analogy. You can do it at home if you would like. What it is that I want you to make a fist and squeeze really hard, exert effort. And I want you to feel that the pain, the painful, racking, piercing feel, the exertion, right? And now let go. Oh, look, no exertion, no extreme striving, no painful, racking, piercing feelings. And what the Buddha would like you to notice is that the painful, racking, piercing feelings were being caused by something that you were doing, not by something you did. That's all he's saying, is that no, no, no. When you are in this state of intense striving, there's painful, racking, piercing feelings. But when you're not, there's not. And that's his simple way of saying, so how do you determine, where did you figure out that painful, racking, piercing feelings are being caused by past actions? So, that makes sense to everybody? All right. So, that's a really important thing right there. It's an important aspect of the Buddha's kind of little argument he's putting together here against the Nigantas. All right. So after making that point, that it's here and now, not from the past, we move over to section 16. And this is another long section that I need to summarize, but I'll do the very first one of these. But the Buddha's next kind of attack, so to speak, on the Niganta's argument, he says, again, bhikkhus, I said to the Nigantas, what do you think, friends? Is it possible that a karma, like a karmic action, whose result is supposed to be experienced right here and now, can that, through exertion and striving, can that become one whose result is experienced in the next life? And they say, no, friend. And then the Buddha is going to say, but is it possible that an action whose result is to be experienced in the next life, can you exert effort and striving and make it result in here and now in this life? And they say, no, friend. All right. Without going through all of these examples, it's at this point that what the Buddha is basically doing is he's basically acknowledging that the Nigantahas, the Jains, are basically what we would call fatalists. Fatalism means, or you could also think of it as determinism, but it's this idea that there's like a grand karmic equation. And the point is that when one performs karmic action, there are karmic results that are absolutely necessary, that they have to happen that way. An example of this that's often used in the world of like Indian philosophy is the example of like an image and a shadow. Like, so I don't know if you can see the shadow of my finger almost, right? There it is. So you can see my shadow of the finger and the finger. And notice how they match up every time. That the shadow never is like, not this time. I'm not going to go over there no, no, because they're intimately related, right? Well, from a certain kind of point of view, karma and karmic consequences are like the shadow and its object, that it just has to go down the way it has to go down. And there's no avoiding that. So again, you can call that fatalism or you can call that determinism, but it's that same idea. It's that the karmic billiard balls have to play out the way they're going to play out. So that's actually the Jain tradition. That's, at least again, according to the Buddhists, that's the Niganta's position, is like pure fatalism. So what the Buddha's saying, and let me just sort of summarize. Yeah, so the Buddha goes through every variation of karmic consequences, and he's basically asking the same question over and over, which is that can you, through intense exertion, can you alter the course of karmic history? Like, can you create a new karmic outcome? And they admit, no, if a karma is going to come to fruition in this life, it's going to come to fruition in this life. There's no way around that. So the Buddha goes through all of this from starting in section 16, and it goes all the way through to the end of section 21. And at the very end of that, section 21, the Buddha says, so it seems to me, friends, that if it's impossible to change the karmic outcome in that way, if it's impossible to do all of that, at the very end, he says, that being so, the Venerable Niganta's exertion is pointless. It's fruitless then. Your striving is fruitless. Now, the Buddha, he gave them the option, right? They could have said, no, you can change karmic consequences, but they were the ones that admitted you can't do that. So the Buddha's just saying, you guys you contradicted yourselves then, right? Okay, so now we get to the first big conclusion of the sutra. There's going to be two big conclusions. So the first one in section 22 or paragraph 22, the Buddha then says to the bhikkhus, after reporting this whole back and forth with the Nigantas, he goes, so speak the Nigantas, bhikkhus. And because the Nigantas speak that way, there are 10 legitimate deductions from their assertions that provide ground for censuring them. All right, so grounds for not believing them. So what are those 10 reasons why they shouldn't be believed, why they should be censured? Well, number one, if the pleasure and pain that beings feel, if the pleasure and pain that beings feel are caused by what was done in the past, then the Nigantas surely must have done evil deeds in the past, since they now feel such painful, racking, piercing feelings. I want to remind you, by the way, the Nigantas, the Jains, are willingly performing these austerities. They are willingly causing themselves discomfort and suffering through fasting and all kinds of other practices. And what the Buddha's saying is yeah, if they have so much suffering and their opinion is that painful feelings is caused by past actions, then dang, they must have done a lot of bad past actions then. And for that reason, they should be censured, right? Number two, if the pleasure and pain that beings feel is caused by God, like if it's punishment and reward from God, basically. So if the pleasure and pain that beings feel is caused by a grand creator being, a supreme God, then the Nigantha surely must have been created by an evil supreme God, since they experience such painful, racking, piercing feelings. So that's number two. Number three, if the pleasure and pain that beings feel is caused by just the circumstances and nature, so just by dumb luck, then the Nigantha surely must have bad luck, since they now have such painful, racking, piercing feelings. Number four, if the pleasure and pain that beings feel is caused by being among the various classes of beings, then the Nigantha surely must belong to the lowest, worst class, since they now feel such painful, racking, piercing feelings. If the pleasure and pain that beings feel is caused by exertion here and now, then the Nigantha surely must strive badly here and now, since they now feel such painful, racking, piercing feelings. If painful, pleasurable feelings that beings feel is caused by what was done in the past, then these Niganthas are to be censured. And if not, then the Niganthas are still to be censured. So either way, he's saying, meaning if painful, racking, piercing feelings are caused by past actions, the Niganthas must be some bad dudes. Right? If they're in such pain in this life, by their own logic, they must be bad dudes. Therefore, they should be censured. And if it's not the case, they should still be censured. Number seven, if the pleasure and pain that beings feel is caused by a supreme creator God, then the Niganthas should be censured, right? And if not, they should still be censured. If the pleasure and pain that beings feel is caused by the various classes of being, then the Niganthas are to be censured because they're of the lowest class. And if not, they should still be censured. If the pleasure and pain that beings feel is caused by exertion here and now, then the Niganthas are to be censured, right? Because they're striving badly here and now. And if not, they are still to be censured. So speak the Niganthas, bhikkhus. And because the Niganthas speak that way, these 10 legitimate deductions from their assertions provide grounds for censuring them. Thus, their exertion is fruitless and their striving is fruitless. All right. So that concludes the Buddha's rant against the Niganthas. And again, I want to remind you, it's kind of a rant against the idea of it's a rant against the idea that anything you're experiencing, like if it's, especially if it's bad, it's the idea that that bad experience is from something from the past. The Buddha or Buddhism wants you to kind of recognize that any painful, racking, piercing, suffering feelings, it's being caused right here and now. That's kind of the teaching. But let's get to the Buddha side. So in paragraph 23, the Buddha says to the bhikkhus, and how is exertion fruitful, bhikkhus? How is striving fruitful? Here, bhikkhus, a bhikkhu, a practitioner, who is not overwhelmed by suffering, does not overwhelm themselves with suffering, and they do not give up the pleasure that accords with the Dharma, yet they are not infatuated with that pleasure. One knows this: when I strive with determination, this particular source of suffering fades away in me because of that determined striving. And when I look on with it, when I look at it with equanimity, this particular source of suffering fades away in me while I develop equanimity. So even before I go any further with this paragraph, I want to make it really clear. There's a particular idea, I forgot to emphasize it. When the Buddha was originally explaining what the Nigantas think, he was talking about their idea that if they performed austerities and they didn't perform any new action, a particular source of suffering, a particular thing would go away. And then through repeated practice of that, all dukkha would go away. So when the Buddha originally was explaining the Nigantas, he was talking about the way that they deal with specific instances of suffering, and then how that eventually builds up to the elimination of all suffering. We are returning to that idea, and the Buddha is using this language of, he's talking about the way that a practitioner should think, and the practitioner thinks, when I strive with determination, this particular source of suffering in me fades away because of that determined striving. So what we are talking about tonight, or what I want to kind of relate this to, is I want to relate this to, well, it's sort of about anything that anything that you've determined that like you have a problem with. It could be drugs and alcohol. It could be scrolling on your phone. It could be sexuality or pornography. It could be whatever it is, but you've already decided that you don't want to do it. You've already decided that it's not serving you. It wasn't the Buddha. It wasn't God. It was you. You decided you don't want to do that anymore. But then you find yourself being drawn to do the thing that you don't want to be doing. And again, this is the nature of addiction. This is the nature of habituation in that way. So we are talking about that kind of suffering tonight. This particular thing that you're desirous of or wanting or craving that you have already decided that you don't, that actually you already know the noble truth of it, which is that it isn't pleasure, right? Okay, so that's what we're talking about, is that kind of a arising, to use Buddhist language, the arising of a sense of craving. And then, of course, we have this delusional idea that that craving could be satisfied by the thing. You already know that you're not going to get satisfaction there. That's why you've determined you don't want to do it. All right. So now let's reread really quickly what the Buddha said. So, and how is exertion fruitful? So exertion is you not doing it, right? So that's the idea of exerting effort, is not doing it, resisting that urge, all right? And so the Buddha says, a practitioner who is not overwhelmed by that suffering, they don't overwhelm themselves with suffering. And this is the important part that I'm always emphasizing, and they don't give up the pleasure that accords with the Dharma. So remember, we're still interested in pleasure here, but we're interested in the pleasure of independence, the pleasure of not needing anything, right? So a practitioner does not get overwhelmed by that suffering, and they do not give up the pleasure of practice, the pleasure of the Dharma, yet they're not infatuated with that pleasure. Very important. We don't exchange our addiction for that to being addicted to the Dharma or being addicted to meditation. So there's not an infatuation with that pleasure. And then the practitioner knows, when I strive with determination, this particular source of suffering fades away in me because of that determined striving. And then when I look on with equanimity, this particular source of suffering fades away in me while I develop equanimity. One strives with determination in regard to that particular source of suffering, which fades away because of that determined striving. And one develops equanimity in regard to that particular source of suffering, which fades away while one is developing equanimity. When one strives with determination, such and such a source of suffering fades away because of that determined striving. Thus, that suffering becomes exhausted. When one looks on with equanimity, such and such a source of suffering fades away while one develops equanimity. Thus, that suffering is exhausted. And as an analogy, because the Buddha always likes to give you a good analogy for how to think about this. So substitute whatever craving suffering thing you've got going on. But the Buddha says, suppose practitioners, suppose bhikkhus, suppose there was a man that loved a woman with his mind bound to her by intense desire and passion. He might see that woman standing with another man, chatting and joking and laughing. What do you think, bhikkhus? Would not sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair arise in that man when he sees that woman standing with another man, chatting and joking and laughing? And the bhikkhus replied, yes, venerable sir. And why is that? Because that man loves that woman with his mind bound to her with intense desire and passion. That's why sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair would arise in him when he sees her standing with another man chatting and joking and laughing. Well, then bhikkhus, that man might think, I love this woman with my mind bound to her by intense desire and passion. But thus, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair arise in me when I see her standing with another man, chatting, joking, and laughing. I know. What if I were to abandon my desire and lust for that woman? And he would abandon his desire and lust for that woman. And then, on a later occasion, he might see that woman standing with another man, chatting and joking and laughing. What do you think, bhikkhus? Would sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair arise in that man when he sees that woman standing with another man, chatting, joking, and laughing? No, venerable sir. And why is that? Because that man no longer lusts after that woman. That's why sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair no longer arise in him when he sees that woman standing with another man, chatting, joking, and laughing. So too, bhikkhus, when a bhikkhu who is not overwhelmed with suffering and does not get overwhelmed with suffering, when they look upon, right, when they does not get overwhelmed with suffering, and when they do not give up the pleasure that accords with the Dharma, yet are not infatuated with that pleasure, they know that when I strive with determination, this particular source of suffering in me fades away. And when I look upon it with equanimity, this particular source of suffering fades away in me. Thus, the suffering becomes exhausted in the practitioner. Thus, bhikkhus, the exertion is fruitful, the striving is fruitful. Okay, so again, that's classic Dharma right there. And I want to put it to you a quick other way really quickly. So our man who's in love with this woman, and she's standing over there chatting and joking and laughing with another dude, right? And the person is upset by that, feels painful, racking, piercing feelings, right? Well, I want you to think about this is my classic Dharma lesson. And what it is that the man is sitting there with the painful, racking, piercing feelings of jealousy. And of course, the man doesn't want to have the painful, racking, piercing feelings, right? And so there's sort of two options. One idea is that if I could like get the girl, right? If I could somehow get the girl away from that other dude and convince her to go out with me, then I wouldn't be experiencing painful, racking, piercing feelings. I would be happy, right? That's one idea. So one way to eliminate the painful, racking, piercing feelings is to kind of get what you want. All right. But you know, there's another way to eliminate the painful, racking, piercing feelings, and it's not lusting or wanting after the girl. And what we want to notice is, from a Buddhist point of view, getting the girl in that case might just be a recipe for more painful, racking, piercing feelings. Because what about the next time she's talking to a guy and laughing and joking, right? Whereas this other option of just abandoning the lust and the craving, and then you are instantly liberated forever, or at least from that particular source of suffering. And then this could eventually go for all sources of suffering. All right. So that's my quick kind of summary of the Buddha's kind of presentation of fruitful striving. Fruitful striving leads to the cessation of painful, racking, piercing feelings. As far as the Buddha kind of can tell, the Niganta practice leads to more painful, racking, piercing feelings. It's kind of a recipe for painful, racking, piercing feelings in that way. All right. Questions, comments, ideas, answers? Everybody doing okay? All right. So this all comes to a beautiful conclusion. So let's kind of keep going. So yeah, so that's the Buddha's example of fruitful striving. I'm now over on number 27. And this is where the original analogy of the surgeon pulling out the arrow, and it hurts when the surgeon's taking the arrow out, but later on it doesn't hurt. We're about to return to that analogy. So in section 27, the Buddha says, again, bhikkhus, a practitioner, a bhikkhu, considers this. You know, While I live according to my pleasures, unwholesome, unhelpful states increase in me, and wholesome states diminish. But when I exert myself in what is hard, in what is painful, unwholesome states diminish in me, and wholesome states increase. What if I exert myself in what is hard, in what is painful, and one exerts themselves in what is painful? When one does so, unwholesome, bad states diminish and wholesome states increase. Then, at a later time, one does not exert oneself in what is painful. And why is that? The purpose for which that bhikkhu exerted themselves in what is painful has been achieved. That's why at a later time, they do not exert themselves in what is painful. Now, the Buddha is going to give an analogy, but I just want to explain really quickly that this is really important, because what he's saying is that this is my interpretation of what he's saying, of course. When he's talking about a practitioner exerting themselves in what is painful or what is hard, I understand that he's talking about, yeah, you want to do that thing, or you want to take that thing, or you want that thing, but you've already decided that you don't want to. And the Buddha's saying, yeah, when you're addicted to something, or when you're deep in craving for something and you resist it, it's hard. It's hard at first. But through removal of that thing, eventually it gets out of your system in that way. And eventually you don't crave it anymore. That's why the Buddha's saying, no, at first it's hard, but at a later time it's not hard. And that's the difference between what the Jains are teaching and what the Buddha's teaching. The Buddha's not saying it's easy, but what he's saying is that the way he's teaching it and what he's teaching, it's not painful, racking, piercing feelings forever. It's just those, he acknowledges that those initial days, weeks, or months, or years could be difficult. So that's my interpretation of that. For example, suppose bhikkhus, this is the Buddha's great analogy, suppose bhikkhus, an arrowsmith, so somebody who makes arrows, were warming and heating an arrow shaft between two hot flames, making it straight and workable. When the arrow shaft had been warmed and heated between the two flames and had been made straight and workable, well, then at a later time, the arrowsmith would not again warm and heat the arrow shaft and make it straight and workable. Why? Because the purpose for which the arrowsmith had warmed and heated the arrow and made it straight and workable has been achieved. That's why at a later time, he wouldn't warm it up again and try to make the shaft straight and workable. So too, bhikkhus, a bhikkhu considers this. And then the Buddha repeats everything he just said about that idea that I'm going to exert now and it's going to be painful, but later on, he's not going to exert effort. You're not going to have to exert effort. And therefore, it won't be accompanied with pain. All right. Everybody feeling that? Everybody okay with that? Now, this is where our sutra could be very long. And I say that because after the Buddha concludes this analogy of making an arrow, and that this is just like practice, which is difficult at the very beginning, but eventually it's not. After doing all of that, we get the famous Again, bhikkhus, a Tathagata appears in the world, accomplished, fully enlightened, and then we get all 10 titles of the Buddha. And what we get, and by the way, they're always referring to other suttas where this is given at length, but this is the description of a Buddha appears in the world, fully enlightened, and then a householder or a householder's son or somebody living at home hears about the Buddha, decides to leave home. They practice and practice and practice, and then eventually they come to abandon the five hindrances. They straighten out their imperfections of mind, and then we get the whole description of the path. So, having thus abandoned the five hindrances, imperfections of the mind weaken, wisdom arises, and then, you guessed it, quite secluded from sensual pleasures, secluded from unwholesome states, the practitioner enters upon and abides in the first jhana, which is accompanied by applied and sustained thought, with rapture and pleasure born of seclusion. Thus, this too, bhikkhus, this is exertion that is fruitful, striving that is fruitful. All right. And then, of course, actually, again, bhikkhus with the stilling of applied and sustained thought, a bhikkhu enters upon and abides in that second jhana, that second meditative state, which has self-confidence and singleness of mind without any applied or sustained thought, also rapturous, full of pleasure, but pleasure this time born of mental concentration. The Buddha says this too is fruitful exertion. This is striving that is fruitful. And then, of course, again, bhikkhus, with the fading away of that rapture, a bhikkhu abides in equanimity, mindful, fully aware, still feeling pleasure with the body, so it's still pleasurable in the third jhana. One enters upon and abides in that third jhana, on account of which the noble ones say, pleasant is the one who abides in equanimity. This too, bhikkhus, is exertion that is fruitful. This is striving that is fruitful. And then finally, with the abandoning of pleasure and pain, and with the previous disappearance of joy and rapture, a bhikkhu enters upon and abides in that fourth jhana, which has neither pain nor pleasure, and a purity of mindfulness due to equanimity. This too, bhikkhus, is exertion that is fruitful. This is striving that is fruitful. And then we get the three wisdoms or the three insights, right? This is the Buddha recollecting past lives, coming to have the divine eye and the awareness of people's future rebirths, and then finally achieving that state of knowledge here and now of the destruction of the taints. And the Buddha is going to say all of that striving is fruitful. All of that exertion is fruitful. All right. So that basically concludes the sutra, but we have one last part. So after the Buddha goes through, and remember, I would like everybody to remember, this would have been a very long sutra if I had included all of the repetitions, if I had included all of the sections that are, found in other suttas. So this would have been a very long mental journey of going through all of this. Yeah, Maria.
Yeah, just a quick comment. It feels like there's a flavor of, like once you've taken the medicine and gotten well, You don't just keep taking the medicine. And it's like the Nigantas are taking a bunch of medicine for a condition that they don't have. It's making them sick. So, just a comment.
That's a very good comment, Maria. And I mean that the analogy with a certain type of medicine, like that it would be bad medicine, right? If you had to keep taking it forever. It would be good medicine if it worked, right? And then you didn't have to take it. So that is exactly, I think, the Buddha's point in that way. Absolutely. Noe, I saw your hand, then it disappeared.
Yes, yes, I put it down.
Oh,
And but in a thing that I'm involved with, it's funny that that tends to keep going back to the suffering that you're once you're sick, you're always sick. You're
mm,
always going to be sick. You're an addict. You're always going to be an addict. Don't ever forget you're an alcoholic. Blah 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 blah. And I tend to I'm bumping heads. This sutra is wonderful for this, to have a conversation with my fellows who I love dearly, to move forward. Because when is it do we finally move forward? Yes. So just an observation there that I definitely will be reading this again and practicing it. Thank you.
excellent, Noe. Yeah, Noe, I mean that's really the message in for me in that way. Especially that idea, even, you mentioned um, well, the idea that I want to also remind everybody this idea that we, it's kind of about even in a way guilt and this idea of like, oh, it's from all of this stuff I did before and the kind of holding on to that before and constantly bringing it into the present versus no, acknowledging that that was before and that's how we got here. But as Noe's always saying, kind of here and now is the message of the sutra, that this is where it starts. Yeah. So, all right. So we have one little extra part of the sutta to go. So the sutta begins, the first part, and the Buddha is talking about the Nigantas and the way they see it. But the Buddha reports his kind of discussion, his back and forth with the Nigantas. And then he comes to this conclusion that based upon this discussion with the Nigantas, what they're selling, like what they're teaching, should be censured. It should, not be taught. It's illogical. It doesn't add up. So the Buddha gives the 10 reasons why the Nigantas should be censured. So that ends the first half of the sutta. Then the Buddha says, all right, bhikkhus, let me tell you how I do it. Here's what I call proper exertion. It's only painful at the beginning, but not forever, all of that. And then the Buddha goes through the whole path, all through the jhanas, all through the accomplishments. And then he says, so now I'm over on the final section, section 46. After repeating all of that, and he says, this too, bhikkhus, is exertion that is fruitful, striving that is fruitful. So the Tathagata speaks, bhikkhus, and because the Tathagata speaks thus, there are 10 legitimate grounds for praising him. Number 1, if the pleasure and pain that beings feel is caused by what was done in the past, then the Tathagata, the Buddha, surely must have done good deeds in the past, since he now feels such taintless, pleasant feelings. If pleasure and pain that beings feel is caused by a creator God, a supreme creator God, well, then the Tathagata surely must have been created by a great supreme God, since he now feels such taintless, pleasant feelings. If the pleasure and pain that beings feel is caused by just circumstances and nature, just by dumb luck, then the Tathagata surely must have the best luck in the world, since he now feels such taintless, pleasant feelings. If the pleasure and pain that beings feel is caused by their class of being, well, then the Tathagata surely must belong to a good class, since he now feels such taintless, pleasant feelings. If the pleasure and pain that beings feel is caused by their exertion here and now, then the Tathagata surely must strive well here and now, since he now feels such taintless, pleasant feelings. If the pleasure and pain that beings feel is caused by what was done in the past, then the Tathagata is to be praised. If not, then the Tathagata is still to be praised. If the pleasure and pain that beings feel is caused by the creative act of a supreme God, then the Tathagata is to be praised. And if not, then the Tathagata is still to be praised. If the pleasure and pain that beings feel is caused by just pure chance, then the Tathagata is to be praised. If not, then the Tathagata is still to be praised. If the pleasure and pain that beings feel is caused by their class of being, then the Tathagata is to be praised. If not, then the Tathagata is still to be praised. And number 10, if the pleasure and pain that beings feel is caused by their exertion here and now, then the Tathagata is to be praised. If not, then the Tathagata is still to be praised. So the Tathagata, the thus come one, speaks. And because the Tathagata speaks thus, there are these 10 legitimate reasons or grounds for praising him. This is what the Blessed One said. The bhikkhus were satisfied and delighted in the Blessed One's words. All right, so that's the Devadaha Sutta, the sutta against the Nigantas. Questions, comments, answers, ideas? Ophir? Oh,
We have to mute him.
Oh.
Give me a second.
okay. We're coming. We're coming.
Okay, hang on one second. I got it.
Okay.
There you go.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mhm.
Wow. Thank you. Powerful thing. Two things to say, like the exertion. Interesting word in this stolen psychology that they stole, I think, from Buddhism. In psychology, they call it extinction burst. Have you heard this term? Anybody else? I don't know, but this is what the idea, which is like so Buddhist, extinction burst. Like you take that behavior, that you take that object away, and there will be a burst, there will be a reaction, but it's because it's about extinction that craving. But once you do it, you will tolerate it, you have perseverance, nothing tragic is going to happen if you're able to, in this sutra, exert the energy, just hold on it. It's going to be hard. And I know, I loved it that he was naming that, you name it, in the middle, and it makes sense energetically, because the first part, the Buddha was mean. It was this lawyer, hyper rational, like destroying. Another point of view is like, Buddha, what's up with you? You're like mean here. But that energy of exertion for that wisdom of true liberation, as Noise said, holding into this thing, but acknowledging we will have this extinction burst when we do that. And if we are, skillful with the jhanas, we are like Aerosmith. If not, we will need to reheat that metal in relapse, because if we just, the problem with a lot of addiction, okay, you take alcohol, so you have donuts. Well, the Aerosmith needs to go to the shop, because if you just replaced it with other stuff, you will need to reheat the metal and do everything. But if you do it fully, and that's the interesting, that he put the dhyana, we haven't heard the dhyanas for a while, but we needed to hear that. So it was such a full round. I really appreciate that. And I see how modern psychology stole from this extinction burst, and to name it, there is hope with that, but you have to hold on.
Excellent comments, Ophir. Just to add to the beautiful comments, I do want to mention about that. There was that thing about, oh, where was it? It was the language of, yes, the extinction, so the exertion, but the language of looking at the particular suffering with equanimity. That's for me, a very important part of the Buddhist practice, which it really helps with avoiding repression. It's one thing to just sort of like out of sight, out of mind, right? But it's another thing to actually be able to sort of stare whatever the desire is, to sort of observe it, but practicing that equanimity. And remember, he emphasized that that was a method of bringing the fading away of it, is looking on it with equanimity. And I think that that's, again, key for avoiding repression in no matter what we're in a way trying to relinquish in that way. So excellent. Noe?
No, here.
Hi, Noe.
There's something that I like to that I've said that I've learned recently, and it speaks just to that. Just because I want a drink doesn't mean I have to have one. Just allow it. I have the sensation of wanting this thing. It comes and goes, but I don't have to have it anymore. So I like that expression, which you just spoke of, which the Buddha just spoke of. Just because it's there, you don't have to indulge it. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent, Noe. Great reminder. When we say looking at it with equanimity, that's a great example, Noe, is understanding that no, the arising of a craving, that's going to happen. Now, the equanimity is the idea that it's not bad or good. It's, probably a biological reaction in that way, and it's sort of something that's happening. But as Noe said, but there's the choice there to act on it or not. But the arising of the craving that's habitual in that sense. So, yeah. So, all right, everybody. I think I'm going to call it a night. That's our conclusion. I forgot to mention, I wanted to mention at the beginning. So no Dharma doors next weekend. I'm taking next weekend off. So we'll be back Sunday, 2 weeks from today, and we will continue in the Devadaha section, this last portion of the Majjhima Nikāya. Really quick announcement too. If you're not on my mailing list, which I think most of you are, but anybody out there in YouTube land, if you're not on my mailing list, go to lotusunderground.com and get on the mailing list, because I'm about to send out something about some upcoming courses in the fall. Also, some of you may know out there, I wrote a novel many years ago, but I just had a new batch reprinted. And so if anybody out there is interested in getting a copy, you can get in touch with me. If you have my email or anything, just let me know and I'll set one aside for you. Otherwise, get on the mailing list so you can find out how to get one when they're available. Other than that, I think that's all the news. thank you all for being here.